So it's been a year since Fantastic Four came out to critical and box office disaster. The movie only got a 9% on Rotten Tomatoes, and it only made about $56 million in the United States. To compare that to something else, Daredevil, another movie considered a terrible disaster, had a 44% on Rotten Tomatoes and made $45 million in its opening weekend. So I finally watched the movie for the first time last night, and I'm not going to review it. Other people have reviewed it. They've done it better than I could. What I'm more interested in is telling the story about how this lack of story came to the screen. Because you've got a great property, you've got a big studio, you had a promising young director, you've got a great cast, and you've got a terrible movie. How did that happen? Of all the problems with this movie, and there are many, the biggest problem is there's no single story running throughout the entire plot line, and therefore it feels disjointed, and it feels like it was directed by different people and edited by different people, because almost certainly it was. And that's the ultimate problem with the movie. So why is that such a big problem? Well, to understand that, you need to understand a plot line. And a plot line is more than just seeing a series of events that tie together. Because you can take, for example, a video camera and put it on the street, and you can film everything that happens. That's not a story, that's just raw data. You can put 3 cameras on a street and edit those 3 cameras together, and that's still not a story, that's just raw data. See, a story involves 5 different things: a setting, characters, plot, conflict, and a theme. And so you take that same street we just talked about it, and you make it Selma, Alabama, and you make it so that Martin Luther King Jr. is on that street in the middle of the racial issues and the civil rights movement. Suddenly, these cameras on the street tell a very compelling story where there's all kinds of conflict, deep themes, all set on this one street. So while Fantastic Four might tie together and one event comes after another event that leads to the final event, those things don't tie quite together the way they really should in thematic ways, where there's a conflict established early on that's resolved in the end. That's not what happens in the movie. Also, to understand how badly this movie failed, you need to understand the 3-act structure of a story. In Act 1, you introduce the characters and you provide the setting under which the events are going to occur. At the end of the first act, there is a crisis. There's a call to action where our protagonist is given a new opportunity. There's an inciting incident which causes something new to happen. This leads into the second act where the body of the story is kind of developed. The themes around the character are developed through kind of the interactions with other characters, and the action is driven, the tension is wound up. This leads to some sort of crisis at the end of the second act where all is lost, where everything they think they're about to gain, they have lost, which leads into the third act where there's a climax and a resolution. This is where the big action comes forward and the thematic elements established early on, where the problems established early on, we see the resolution to that leads to the final conclusion of the movie. In the movie that we actually got, we get a 50-minute long first act where you introduce these 5 characters who are all struggling with their identity and their purpose and how to work together. The conflict of it is very much man against himself. Each one of these people trying to find their place in this world, working together on this one project to transport stuff to a different dimension or a different location. The first act crisis involves them using this teleportation device, going to a different dimension, things go wrong, a member of the team dies, and then 4 of them get new powers. When you go into the second act, now the movie is about these scientists that are turned into monsters that realize they still don't have a place in this world, and the military decides to give them a place in this world as a part of their special forces team, and they're locked in this one location, and one member of the team decides to flee from this new purpose in life. The crisis going into the third act is the member of the team that died comes back from the dead and decides that he wants to go back to the place they took him from, the other dimension, and destroy the Earth in the process, so the team comes together to fight him, and that's the climax of our movie. Now, when I describe it that way, it sounds as if this kind of ties together, but in practice, it doesn't. The conflict of the first act of the movie is all about them versus themselves trying to find their identity. The second act moves it into this man versus society conflict where the military is trying to use them and stripping them of their identity. And then when we get to the third one, it's man against man as Doom out of nowhere wants to destroy the world, so they have to stop him. That isn't established anywhere in the previous 2 acts, in his motives, in his actions, as a theme throughout the movie. The way the story comes together, it's not like the culmination of their teamwork. It's just kind of language they throw in at the very end. The second act really can almost be removed entirely from the movie. It's almost as if you could go straight from they come back from this dimension to Doom is evil and trying to blow up the world, and almost nothing would be different in the movie. Here's a key thing, and I look at the times on this. The first act is 50 minutes, the second act is 20 minutes, and then the third act is 20 minutes. Over half of this movie is the setup for a totally different movie than the one that we got. And then you rush through a second act that doesn't really point towards the third act that we get. They're just events that come right one after the other. And you have to wonder, how did this happen? A plot that so does not tie together, and the themes established early on of purpose and identity are not what pays off in the third act. The tensions of Doom trying to end this world to save his world because we're destroying our world are not established in the first 80% of this movie. When you talk about story structure, some people start to accuse you of wanting to be too formulaic, of removing creativity from the process. That's not what I'm advocating. What I'm talking about is a story that has themes that run throughout, that things are set up early on that pay off in the end. That there are twists along the way that you can't predict. But when you look back on the movie, it all makes sense, and you can see the plan that was started early on. And this end was inevitable while still being clever and interesting. Whereas in this movie, this end to the movie was not inevitable. It wasn't set up. It wasn't clever. It was just what they had to do to have a big finale at the end. To understand how this mess happened, you have to follow through the story of what happened. So back in 2012, Josh Trank, who was only 27 years old, releases his movie Chronicle, which was made pretty low budget, only $12 million, and it goes on to make over $100 million worldwide. So suddenly this guy is the next wonderkind of Hollywood that everyone wants to get him to work on their project. So Fox hires him that same year to make Fantastic Four. Jump forward 2 years after that, Josh Trank is then hired to do another Star Wars movie, which this is incredibly exciting because Disney's only going to hire the best. And so in theory, what this meant was what they were seeing from what he was doing on Fantastic Four, what Fox was saying about him, what was going on, was very, very inspiring to people. They were thinking, this guy has a lot of potential. He must be really good. Let's let him make a Star Wars movie. And then you get to January 2015, and rumors have started to circulate about the reshoots, and is the movie changing? Did things fall apart? So there's an interview that you can read, I put it in the notes below, with Josh Trank and Simon Kinberg, where they're talking about the production, and it's a long interview. And they address the reshoots, the rewrites, the moving from a small budget to big budget. And throughout the whole thing, either it just comes off like Josh Trank is still having a great time working on a movie, and it's hard, but things are still going well. Jump forward to May. Josh Trank doesn't show up to Star Wars Celebration saying that he's sick, and so he doesn't give an interview about his Star Wars spin-off movie. Within a month after that, he announces that he's no longer on the project. Then the movie isn't screened for critics. All sorts of rumors circulate that it's a terrible, terrible mess. The reviews start to come in just days beforehand. They're dismal. The day before the movie comes out, Josh Trank goes on Twitter, disowns it, says there was a great movie that he had a year before, but no one will ever see the movie. Movie comes out, it tanks at the box office. Even more rumors start to come out of the process of how the movie was made, and all sorts of crazy influence and interference from the studio. And this train wreck of a movie is released to dismal returns. It's hard to know where to start to try and unravel all the mess of how this thing fell apart. But there's a lot of clues out there. And after the movie was released, several different sources started to report that right before the movie went into production, Fox told Trank he had to cut 3 different action sequences from the movie for budget reasons. So you can see where a movie that already clearly doesn't have a ton of action in it, when you remove 3 action sequences, it becomes just a straight drama. And then as you hear the stories about it, he goes on to make his movie and seemed pretty content with what happened until the studio start to see what happened. And then the list of writers involved in this movie is pretty extensive. And of the reshoots, the rewrites, all this starts to happen, and Trank starts to get removed from the process. And so in the trailers, you see a shot of the thing jumping out of a plane that's not in the movie. And the rumor is that Trank wrote that he did animatics for it, that you could see the CGI version of it, and then the studio wanted to cut it. Then when they realized the movie didn't have enough action in it, they wanted to put the movie back in, and they had other people shoot it, but they shot it in the wrong style, so it didn't fit in the movie. And so then there was a sequence that is in the trailers that's not in the movie, and all of this back and forth that I'm sure was a nightmare for him, frustrating for them, and created a terrible end result that's a mishmash of visions. And some of this is even confirmed when you look at the interview that Trank gave in January of 2015, where he talks about how his first draft of it was about 2 hours and 10 minutes long, and then that ended up, he said he wanted it to be about 2 hours long, and then the final movie ends up being 93 minutes long. So just right there, you know that there's about 30 more minutes of plot, probably from the second and third acts, that was filmed and cut. Then you add to that there were 3 action sequences that weren't even filmed, or maybe only one of them was filmed. And so you can see how this movie, this vision that he originally had, gets shrunk and transformed and morphed and edited and reshot and recut into something totally different that's unrecognizable. And while you can see where the first 40-ish minutes of this movie are very consistent in one narrative that seems to be pointing in one direction as this character study of scientists turning into monsters as they try and figure out their own personal identity, that is not what the movie ended up being when the studio started to change things and demand rewrites and reshoots. And the way it turns out, there's kind of 3 different versions of this movie. There's the one that Josh Trank agreed to make, there's the one that he shot, and then there's the one that they edited together and released. Which one's the real one? Well, none of them are. There is no real Fantastic Four movie. It's just a hodgepodge of incomplete visions that were forced into existence. While the movie itself is not a great 3-act structure, the story of Josh Trank in this movie is a very interesting 3-act story. Act 1, we meet Josh Trank, a talented 27-year-old director who's given the opportunity at the end of the first act to direct Fantastic Four, a dream project for him to be able to direct this gigantic blockbuster movie that has set his career up for life. In the second act, we spend time with him in pre-production, production of the movie, and you can see the tension starting to form as this great opportunity to work with the studio starts to not look like a great opportunity where they have differences, but still, he has a great opportunity. But as we move through this second act, clearly the tensions keep growing deeper and deeper, and their visions are going further and further apart. So finally, we get to the end of the second act, and where this thing that first looked like a dream has become a nightmare, and these people that had given him this great opportunity have become his biggest adversaries, and eventually cuts to the point where he's kicked out of the editing room of his own movie. And then we move into the third act, as the movie is released, and he realizes that satisfaction isn't found in Hollywood and in fame, and he even burns bridges by putting a tweet out distancing himself from Hollywood and choosing to seek satisfaction in his own projects. It's basically the same thing as That Thing You Do, except all the parts that are totally different. That's what makes this story so interesting to me, is that story is far more compelling to me than the story that they did tell. Because if you make a comedy and you make people laugh, it doesn't matter if everything else fails. If you make an action movie and the action is spectacular, it makes up for everything else. But when you make a serious, dramatic superhero movies and the heroes aren't heroic, they're not fun and funny, and the story does not work and it is not dramatic, you have an utter and total mess on your hands. That is the story of Fantastic Four. And it's a fascinating one that I hope someday they make a documentary about this, and they get Josh Trank and they get Simon Kinberg and they get every producer, and we get the full story of how this amazing director, this amazing cast, this great studio made such a terrible, terrible movie. So what did you think about Fantastic Four? Was it as bad as everybody says it was? And why did that happen? What do you think is the key thing that made this movie just fall apart? Comment in the comment section. Let's talk about it. If you like this deeper analysis of movies, please consider clicking that subscribe button. Join in the comment section. I respond to almost every comment. I like to talk movies, and I like to talk with you about movies. So join us in the comment section. Thank you for watching.